simplify now while she's still cooperative. My daughter wrote that about me in a shared document called Mom's Next Steps. By the time I found it, someone had already circled the date I was supposed to leave my own house. 3 weeks earlier, I'd told my children the inheritance was gone. $283,000 had disappeared from my brokerage account without a single explanation, and almost overnight, the phone stopped ringing. They thought they'd lost an inheritance. I thought I'd lost my money. We were both wrong. I'd spent 31 years balancing other people's books. I knew numbers don't disappear. They get moved. Hidden. Renamed. But they always leave a trail. So I bought a $3 spiral notebook, wrote down every phone call, every statement, every visit, every lie, and followed the numbers until they led me to the one thing no one expected me to find. By the time I closed that notebook, every dollar had a name attached to it, and so did the person who would never inherit another cent from me. My name is Vivian. This is how losing an inheritance turned out to be the only honest audit my family ever faced. Let me back up and tell you how a woman ends up doing arithmetic at her own kitchen table like it's a crime scene. I kept the books for a regional auto parts distributor for 31 years. Payroll, receivables, the whole ledger, by hand for the first decade and by computer after that, but the rule never changed: every number has a reason. If a column didn't balance, you didn't shrug and move on. You found the reason, even if it took all night, because a number that doesn't balance is a number that's hiding something. Stay with me through the next minute, because two names in it, Gary, and my granddaughter Nora, end up on opposite sides of everything that follows. My husband Harold used to tease me about it. He'd watch me recheck a grocery receipt at the kitchen table and say, "Vivian, the store isn't stealing from us." He was usually right. He managed our investments himself for most of our marriage, and when a doctor from the county told him, 4 years ago, that his heart had maybe 18 months left in it, one of the last things he did was sit me down with Gary Whitfield, the man who'd handled our accounts since before our son Peter finished college, and say, "Take care of her the way you take care of your own mother." Gary shook Harold's hand and said he would. Harold died a year later. I trusted that handshake the way I trust very little else in this world. For 3 years after that, I did what Harold taught me. I opened the statement every quarter, I checked the total against the last one, I filed it, and I moved on. I never once read it the way I used to read a stack of invoices, looking for the thing that didn't add up. I had no reason to. It was Gary. It was family, practically. We kept up a small tradition Harold started, a state of things, dinner every few months, nothing formal, just a chance to say out loud whatever needed saying about the house, the money, the will, instead of leaving it to guessing. Peter usually ran those conversations the way he runs a sales floor, quick with a number, quicker to spot when one didn't hold up. More than once he'd caught an error in my own arithmetic before I had, and I'd been proud of that, the way you're proud of a child who grew into a skill you recognize. Karen, who sells houses for a living, could read a room or a contract in about the same amount of time. I'm telling you this now because it matters later. These were not people who missed things. That's what made the next few months so hard to make sense of. I wasn't tricked by a stranger, is what I mean. I stopped checking the one place I'd built my whole career on checking. The first crack came on an ordinary Tuesday, this past June. I opened the statement to file it, the way I always do, and my eyes caught on the total before my brain had decided to look. $685,000 in March. $402,000 in June. I read it 3 times, certain I was misreading a column, the way you're certain a receipt is wrong before you actually add it up. I wasn't misreading it. $283,000 had left that account in 1 quarter, and next to the number that should have explained it, dividend reinvestment, market adjustment, something ordinary, there was a line I'd never once seen on any statement in 20 years, Q2 discretionary reallocation. I called Gary's office. His assistant said he was traveling and would call back Thursday. He didn't call back Thursday. I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that week, because it wasn't suspicion yet. It was fear. Plain, old-fashioned fear, the kind that has nothing to do with evidence. I thought about the roof that needed replacing in a few years. I thought about whether I could still afford my share of Nora's tuition, the promise I'd made her at her high school graduation. I did the thing frightened people do. I assumed the worst and started planning around it, instead of asking a single question first. I called a state of things dinner for that Friday, the first one I'd ever called without Harold's steadier voice in the room to soften it. I sat Peter and Karen down at that same kitchen table and told them plainly, the account had lost a lot of value, more than I understood, and there wasn't going to be the kind of inheritance any of us had always assumed there'd be. I told them to stop planning around money that wasn't there anymore. I watched their faces do two different things. Karen said all the soft, correct things. Mom, we just want you to be okay, money was never the point. Peter went quiet in a way I recognized from 30 years of watching men do math in their heads at a register. He asked one question. How much, exactly? I told him. He nodded slowly, like a man confirming a number he'd already half expected. I want to be completely clear about something, because it matters for everything that follows. I was not testing anyone. I told my children the truth as I understood it that night, out of fear, not strategy. Whatever they did next, they did to themselves. I only found out because I couldn't stop myself from keeping score. That's a habit too, and it turned out to be the only one that saved me. 3 weeks went by, and the Sunday calls that had come like clockwork for years, Peter's check-ins, Karen's updates on the grandkids, thinned out to almost nothing. Peter called once, for 6 minutes, mostly about a car repair. Karen texted twice. I told myself people get busy. Then I noticed I was telling myself that a lot. Old habits don't retire just because you do. I bought a small spiral notebook, the same kind I used to log account discrepancies at the office, and without fully admitting to myself why, I started writing down every call, every visit, the date, and how long it lasted. I told myself it was nothing. A bookkeeper doesn't start a ledger over nothing. By the 4th week, the notebook told a story I didn't want to read. Peter, 1 call, 6 minutes. Karen, 2 texts, no visits. And on the same page, a name that needed its own column entirely, my granddaughter Nora, 24, in her 2nd year of nursing school, working weekend shifts at a diner to help cover rent. 14 visits. Every single Sunday, sometimes a Wednesday besides, usually with a container of soup she'd made herself, sometimes with nothing at all, just to sit at my table and tell me about a professor or a patient she wasn't supposed to talk about in detail. One Sunday she noticed the porch light had been flickering for months. I'd mentioned it once, in passing, back in the spring, and she fixed it herself before she left, without saying a word about it. 14 visits from a 24-year-old working 2 jobs to pay her own tuition. 1 phone call from a son who sells industrial equipment for a living and has never once forgotten a customer's follow-up date. I mentioned the notebook, almost as a joke, to my friend Alice over coffee that week. We'd worked in the same office building for 20 years, different companies, same lunch counter. She didn't laugh. She just looked at me for a second and said, "Vivian, you used to catch a 2-cent error in 10,000 lines of a ledger without blinking. What is this one actually telling you?" I didn't have an answer yet. But I stopped pretending, after that I was only keeping the notebook out of idle curiosity. I am not proud of what I did next, but I understood it, and maybe you will too. I stopped seeing it as grief and started seeing it as a pattern, the way I used to see a column of numbers that all leaned the same direction. Something was being calculated. I just didn't know what yet. The answer came to me by accident, the way the best evidence usually does, not because I went looking, but because I was paying attention when it appeared. Nora came by on a Tuesday to help me sort through a stack of mail I'd been ignoring, and she left her laptop open on my kitchen table while she went to answer her phone in the other room. A document was open on the screen. I wasn't trying to read it. But the title caught my eye before I could look away, Mom's Next Steps, and under it, a shared thread between Peter and Karen, calm, organized, the kind of writing you use for a work project, not a parent. They were discussing which of them should take the lead on moving me into a smaller senior living community. The reasoning was laid out in tidy bullet points, the kind Karen writes for open house walkthroughs: no estate left to protect, no reason to carry two households. Smaller footprint equals easier for everyone to manage long term. Simplify now while she's still cooperative. That last phrase sat wrong with me longer than any of the others. Cooperative. Like I was a listing they were trying to close before the market shifted. There was a moving date already circled in the document's calendar view, 3 months out, like a deadline on a work project. I want you to notice what wasn't in that document, because I noticed it before anything else. Not one line asking whether I was okay. Not one line about what I wanted. Just logistics. Whose turn it was to handle me. I photographed the screen with my own phone before Nora came back, the way you'd photograph a crack before it gets covered over with paint. I didn't say anything to her. She had nothing to do with it, and I wasn't ready to say the words out loud yet, not even to myself. I want to admit something here, because it's part of the story. For a few days after finding that document, I talked myself half out of what I'd seen. Peter had always been the practical one, I told myself. I was a grieving widow reading cruelty into a spreadsheet built by two tired, busy adults. I nearly deleted the photo of that screen. My thumb was actually on it. I've thought about that moment a great deal since, how easy it is to talk yourself out of your own evidence when the alternative is believing something painful about people you raised. I didn't delete it. I filed it in the same folder as the notebook, the way you file a discrepancy you're not ready to act on yet but aren't willing to lose either. It was Nora, without knowing what she'd started, who cracked the second half of this open. A week later, she was helping me go through a folder of old paperwork, and she picked up a printout of that June statement. I'd left it out, still trying to make sense of it, and she frowned at the Q2 discretionary reallocation line the way I had. "Grandma," she said, "did you actually approve this? This doesn't sound like something you'd do. You read everything twice." I opened my mouth to say of course I did, the way you defend a decision out of pure habit. And then I stopped, because I honestly couldn't remember signing anything. I'd trusted Gary the way you trust a signature you never actually watched yourself write. Stay with me here, because this is the part where the story stopped being about my family and started being about my own money, and I promise it gets more concrete than a bad feeling. That question sat with me all night. The next morning, for the first time in 20 years, I called someone who wasn't Gary Whitfield to ask about my own money. A friend from my old office had used a fee-only financial planner named Priya Anand after her divorce, and I called and asked for an hour of her time, and paid for it myself, out of what was left in my checking account, because some part of me already understood I needed an opinion Gary hadn't shaped. Priya's office was small and quiet, nothing like Gary's, no leather chairs, no framed photos of him shaking hands with people at golf tournaments, just a woman with 3 monitors and a legal pad, going through my statements line by line the way I used to go through a vendor's invoice when something felt off. "Walk me through what you remember signing," she said, and I told her honestly, nothing specific. Gary had always just handled it. She nodded like she'd heard that sentence before, more than once, from people my age. It took her less than 20 minutes to find it. The reallocation that had moved a large, safe portion of my bond ladder into a high-fee, high-volatility fund wasn't authorized by any signed document. It was a single checked box on an online form, a box that, under the rules her own firm followed, was never supposed to be treated as full authorization for a change that size. "This isn't a gray area," she said. This is a compliance problem. She pulled the timestamp. The form had been submitted the same week Peter had mentioned, almost in passing at a family barbecue, that he'd had lunch with Gary. Just catching up, he'd said, the kind of thing that means nothing until it means everything. I remember sitting very still in that office chair, feeling the particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with the room's temperature. 20 years I had let one man's handshake with my dying husband stand in for my own attention. I did not enjoy learning that Harold's trust and my own carelessness had both been resting on the same unchecked assumption. I sat in Priya's office and felt something shift under everything I'd believed for 3 weeks. This was never really about the market having a bad quarter. Someone had moved my money into exactly the kind of investment that would produce a big, frightening, believable loss on paper, and it had happened in the same window my own son was sitting across a lunch table from the man who managed it. Here is where this stopped being a story about who calls me on Sundays, and became a story about who benefits from me looking like I can no longer manage my own life. Stay with me, because it gets more specific than a suspicion. Before I went further, I did what I still believe was the fair thing to do. I called Gary myself and asked him directly to explain the Q2 reallocation and why there was no signature on file for it. He was smooth about it, the way 20 years of practice makes a person smooth. Vivian, we send disclosures on every account change, it's all standard procedure. I'd have to pull the file to say more. I asked when he could pull the file. He said he'd get back to me by the end of the week. He didn't. I called again the following Monday and got his assistant, who was very kind and very unable to tell me anything. I want to be fair to Gary in this telling. I don't know for certain what he intended. I only know that a man who has always returned my calls within a day stopped returning them the moment I asked a question with a real answer attached to it. I still had one legal right I hadn't used. As the account holder, I could formally request my full advisory file from Gary's firm, every note, every call log, every internal record connected to my account. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I only knew that a ledger that doesn't balance eventually tells you where to look, if you're patient enough to keep pulling the thread. I want you to sit with the weight for a moment, because I had to. 9 days of not knowing is longer than it sounds when you already suspect what's coming. The file arrived 9 days later, thick as a phone book, mostly boilerplate, market summaries, standard disclosures, page after page that told me nothing. I brought it to Diane Okafor, an elder law attorney a friend from church had used years ago, and we sat at her conference table for most of an afternoon going through it together, page by page, the way I used to go through year-end reconciliations, checking one column against another until something finally didn't match. Buried in the middle of it, filed under a section labeled, Client Contact, Miscellaneous, was a call log entry from 2 months before the reallocation, 2 months before I even opened that June statement. It read, Call from family member, son, client's cognitive capacity, asset protection options for aging parent. I read it 4 times. Diane let me, quiet in the particular way of someone who has seen this exact shape before and knows better than to rush it. When I finally looked up, she said, I want to be careful here, because I can't tell you what was in his head. But I can tell you what this phrase usually precedes. Families explore asset protection and capacity questions when they're considering a petition for financial guardianship, and that petition is a great deal easier to bring, and much harder to fight, when the parent's own account already looks like proof she can't manage money. I sat with that for a long moment. Peter hadn't called Gary because of a crisis. Whatever happened next, whether it was planned in exact detail or simply an opportunity Gary was careless or willing enough to hand him, my son had gone looking for a door into my finances before there was any real reason to. And 2 months later, a door appeared. I don't know, even now, exactly how much of it Peter intended and how much of it Gary did on his own, sensing an opening and taking it, the way a man who's managed money too long sometimes forgets whose money it actually is. I'm not interested in guessing at intentions I can't prove. I'm only interested in what I can document, and what I can document is enough. I did not call Peter that night. I did not call Karen. I did the thing that has never once failed me in 31 years. I got my own records in order before I said a single word to anyone. I fired Gary Whitfield in writing, a short letter Diane helped me draft, stating plainly that I was terminating our advisory relationship effective immediately and formally disputing the Q2 reallocation as unauthorized. Priya helped me file the dispute with his firm's compliance office, laying out the missing signature, the timestamp, all of it, cleanly, the way you'd present a discrepancy you already know you can prove. Facing a documented gap in their own authorization records, and the plain threat of a regulatory complaint, the firm agreed within 3 weeks to unwind the trade and restore the account to what it would have been worth without it. The money was never really gone. It came back with a paper trail explaining exactly how it had disappeared, and exactly who had been asking questions before it did. I sat with the restored statement for a long time before I did anything else with it. Then I called Peter and Karen and asked them each, separately, to come by, not for a family dinner, just to talk, at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd told them the money was gone in the first place. Peter came first. I laid it out in order, the way I'd laid out a discrepancy report 100 times at the office, the notebook, the mom's next steps document, the unauthorized checkbox, the call log entry, the date of his lunch with Gary. I didn't accuse him of engineering all of it on purpose. I told him, honestly, that I no longer knew which parts were carelessness and which were convenience, and that I'd decided not knowing was its own kind of answer. He went very still. Then he got defensive, the way people do when the ground moves under them faster than their pride can catch up. I was trying to protect you, he said. You don't understand how these firms operate, how easy it is for someone your age to get taken advantage of. I asked him, gently, whether he'd ever once asked me if I wanted that kind of protecting, or whether he'd simply decided I needed it. He didn't answer that directly. He said the call to Gary had been just exploring options, in case, the same phrase Diane had warned me families use. I asked him what, exactly, he'd been expecting to happen, in case. He didn't have an answer for that either, or he had one and chose not to say it out loud in my kitchen. I've decided I don't need to know which. He asked, finally, if this meant he was cut out of everything now, and I told him, honestly, that I didn't have that answer yet either. What I did have, I said, was a notebook, a document with his name on it, and a call log entry with a date on it, and none of those were things I'd invented. Karen came the next evening and took a softer road to roughly the same place. I didn't know what Gary actually did, she said. I just thought there was genuinely nothing left, so there was nothing left to plan around. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Mom. I believed that she believed it. I also told her that believing a convenient story instead of asking one direct question was its own kind of choice, made over and over, for 3 weeks, while her daughter kept showing up and asking nothing. Neither of them fully denied what the documents showed. Neither of them fully owned it either. I have thought about that a great deal since, how rarely people confess cleanly to the thing that actually happened, and how much of what passes for an apology is really just discomfort dressed up as regret. The weeks after were not simple, and I won't pretend they were. Peter didn't call for almost a month. At Karen's insistence, I went to my sister-in-law's Thanksgiving, and I could feel, without anyone saying it directly, that a version of the story had traveled ahead of me, that Mom was being dramatic about one bad investment, that families go through hard patches and I'd chosen to make mine public inside itself. My cousin Bev asked me, in the careful, lowered voice people use when they've already decided what they think, whether I was doing all right, really. I told her I was doing better than I had in months, and let her make of that what she wanted. I let the rest of it sit. I've learned that correcting every version of a story that isn't mine to control is its own kind of exhausting, and I no longer have the years to spend on it. With Diane's help, I rewrote my financial power of attorney and my healthcare proxy, naming Nora in Peter's place. I updated my will to reflect what I now know instead of what I'd simply assumed out of habit for 20 years. I want to be honest that this wasn't punishment. It was protection, the same kind Harold asked Gary for on his deathbed, except this time I was the one deciding who'd actually earned it. The door isn't locked to Peter. I told him that directly, the second time he called, 4 weeks later, asking, not demanding, asking, if he could come by on a Sunday like he used to. I said yes. It was one conversation, careful on both sides, unfinished in the way real repair usually is. I don't know yet what we'll build out of it. I know it will have to be built, not simply assumed back into existence the way it was before. I think about the 20 years I spent trusting a handshake instead of reading a statement the way I'd been trained to read one. I'm not interested in punishing myself over it the way I once might have been. I've decided there's a difference between the carelessness of trusting someone you have every reasonable right to trust, and the carelessness of a son who went looking for a door before there was a storm to justify opening one. I can hold both of those without pretending they're the same size. Nora doesn't know any of the legal details, even now. I haven't told her what's in the new documents. She still comes on Sundays, still brings soup half the time, still asks about my week before she talks about her own. The porch light she fixed still comes on every evening at dusk, on its own timer, exactly the way it's supposed to. I never told her I noticed she'd fixed it. I don't think she was waiting to be thanked. That's exactly why the new papers have her name on them, not because of what I lost, but because of what never went missing in the first place. If you told your own family there was nothing left to inherit, who do you think would still show up, and would you actually want to find out? I don't believe there's a wrong answer to that question, and I'd genuinely like to hear yours in the comments. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Broken Bonds, and I'll see you at the next one.